Today, let's talk a little about canon and somewhat what it means to the Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves movie. Welcome back to those who've been here before. Welcome to those of you who are new to the channel. My name is Bobby. This is part of the Geek Cabal channel. The other two gentlemen are not with me here in my car. When time permits, we get together and record videos. Or we record solo videos as time permits. So, today, I want to talk a little about canon. Now, for those of you who don't know what canon is, it's essentially what is, like, official, okay? Because whenever you have a sprawling franchise, you know, you've got different things in it that have information involved with them. And some of that information is canon, and some of it's not. Now, as I understand it, and I could be mistaken here, so please bear with me because I am not a religious scholar. The initial concept actually has to do with the Bible and Christianity. Essentially, there are more books to the Bible than what are in the Bible. And I believe the other books are known as Apocrypha. I believe. Who made these decisions and why? It's a long time ago. I believe it's the Council of Nicaea. Because they were going to print several copies. They were going to create, couldn't print yet, several copies on order from the Emperor Constantine, the Roman Emperor Constantine, who converted to Christianity and converted the empire, I believe. So, they had to decide what's official and what's not, because by that point in time, there was what is now called the Old Testament, which were books imported from Judaism, and not all of them made the transition, so they had to decide which ones were and weren't part of the canon. And then there's the books of the New Testament. Now, I don't know if anything there didn't make the cut, because again, I'm not a religious scholar. I assume things did not. So, fast forward to today, and we use the term, and by the way, it's C-A-N-O-N, single N. Double N is the weapon that fires cannonballs that you typically see on a pirate ship, or laying siege to a fortress or something. So, as it relates to, like, say, Star Wars or Star Trek, or Dungeons & Dragons, Harry Potter, you know, Transformers, G.I. Joe, whatever, it's essentially what is, from the standpoint of whoever owns and controls the IP, it's what is accepted fact about the IP. So, to give you a couple of examples, because different companies have different approaches. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is Star Trek, which, unless it has changed since I last read about it, which was a while ago, the official policy of Paramount Pictures, who owns Star Trek, is that if it's on screen somewhere, it's canon. If it's not, if it's from like a book, a novel, a comic, something else, then it's not canon. Now, I don't know if they have a secondary canon that includes the books to make sure they're internally consistent or anything like that. Excuse me, I have no idea on that. Star Wars is a complicated situation that before the end of my description, that's going to involve some stupidity. So, while George Lucas owned Star Wars, the official position was anything on screen, so the movies are the primary source. And then I believe the Clone Wars and I think Rebels were all actually, like, all had episodes going before the sale to Disney. So anything in those two shows was also canon. I believe the one exception to this is the Christmas special, but I could be wrong. That might actually be canon. So, now anything else, there was a secondary tier to the canon. That was all the comics, novels, video games, and like technical readout type books and things like that. All of that, the idea was, so long as it doesn't contradict the movies, it's considered canon. But the movies at any point could override what was in there. Okay? So they made a fair attempt at keeping that internally consistent. There's not a whole lot of bits and pieces that don't work in there. And the main conflict actually comes with a little bit about the prequel trilogy, because the books were never supposed to touch that time frame because Lucas meant to make the movies. And so he didn't want to be in conflict with any of that. And the handful of books that kind of do touch that time frame, they don't quite get everything right. So you have that. But a lot of the information, a lot of like the technical information, comes from the role-playing game from, I think it was West End Games. That's where a lot of like the sizes of the ships, the number of their armaments, the crew capacities, all that kind of stuff starts showing up there. And a lot of ideas show up there that eventually filter into the books and the novels. And there was a whole like reasonably tight canon built up in the books, in the comics and everything, the video games. And then came the sale to Disney, and Disney made what, in my opinion, is in the running for the worst decision they made with the franchise. And that is to just completely nuke the expanded universe and say none of that's canon anymore. We're going to make our own canon because we're intellectually bankrupt, so we don't have to compete with actual good ideas. We just have the name, we'll just put shit ideas out on paper under that name, and, people will buy it because it's Star Wars. That's basically what they did. Now, there's some exceptions to that. I'm given to understand some of the comics are actually decent. I don't read them because, well, after a company tells me all the stuff I've invested a lot of time and money in no longer counts, I'm not going to think the things they create count. It's pretty simple, So, but yeah, that's definitely in the running for the worst decisions they made. That's right up there with hiring J.J. Abrams, going into the prequel trilogy with no defined plan, and thinking that you had to essentially soft reboot the series, and then add in nuking the EU, and like almost everything wrong with Star Wars at the moment descends from one or more of those four decisions. It's amazing how simple decisions just create like a cascade failure throughout the whole system like that, and how it was mostly foreseeable too. So that speaks of the incompetence of management there. And yes, Kathleen Kennedy's incompetent. She wants to put her name on there, and she's going to, as the person that destroyed Star Wars. Congratulations. You will be studied in business school for your incompetence. Congrats. So anyway, back to canon. I'm not bitter at all about Star Wars. So back to canon. What does this have to do with D&D? Okay, so D&D is a little trickier. There's not so much a Dungeons and Dragons canon. There's canon for the various settings. Greyhawk, Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms, Dark Sun, Eberron, and some of them have different rules for canon. For the Forgotten Realms, and we know this because Ed Greenwood has stated as such, the contract that he has with Wizards of the Coast states very clearly that the novels are canon. whatever wishy-washy bullshit Wizards of the Coast put out recently about this is wrong. Like, the novels are canon. So, with Eberron, that is not the case. The novels are considered a what-if. With Dragonlance, the novels are canon, because they are the canon. Dark Sun, they were canon, but then with 4th edition, I think they just said the first book of the Prism Pentad is canon. So the first book's where they overthrow the one sorcerer king, and I can't think of his name off the top of my head. But the problem is the rest of the series, the other 4 books, kind of overthrow all the other sorcerer kings, destroy the dragon, and eliminate most of the problems of the world. So there's not really much of a setting left to use. So 4th edition envisions it as the first book has occurred, so there's one free city-state. The other 4 books are a maybe, a what-if. Alright. So, how does the movie fit into all this? Well, the movie and the novels have at least one conflict. So given that, and given that the novels have supremacy, the movie can't, in its entirety, can't be canon. Because then you have a canon conflict. Now, parts of the movie can be made canon, like the characters have been made canon. They've got stats, so presumably they are canon characters now for the realms. The overarching events of the movie can be made canon. There's prequel novels. If there's a novelization of the movie, then I guess technically that counts too. Although I dare say the novelization will involve the same plot problems. So, I don't know. Then you have canon conflict, which that's what having editors is supposed to avoid. But Wizards of the Coast decided they didn't need them a while ago. So, brilliant decision making over there. Real grade A team. They, so what that means is there are parts of the movie that can't be canon, which means the movie can't be canon. Also, given that the movie, the way it's going at the moment, is unlikely to receive a sequel, I don't know how much weight they're going to put into everything in the movie being canon. Like, I think that they'll eventually be like, yeah, I mean, the characters are, here's their stats, they've already done that. And then just be like, either the events happened or they didn't, it's up to you. Which brings us to the other kind of oddity that you have with Dungeons & Dragons. Canon only matters for novels, source books, not the tabletop game. Because the tabletop game, you can't play a canon version of the game. The moment your characters are introduced, your characters don't exist in canon, unless you're specifically playing canon characters, in which case I don't know what you're doing. You can't follow their guide, follow their path verbatim. Otherwise, you're literally just moving imaginary pieces around, replaying a book you've already read. Like, you could do that, I guess, but I don't know what you're doing. Like, I don't know what your end goal there is. So, it only really matters for writing future novels, so you know what the past is, or the present, or wherever you're set. For the source books, because you have to know what events have and have not officially occurred, and for adventure paths and adaptations like a movie, So canon or not doesn't affect your home game unless you want it to. Now, if you went and watched the movie, you're like, hey, I like everything I see here. plop it down in your realms. Go for it, have at it. It's your game. I'm just saying that because of the conflicts, the movie can't be. Now, the vast majority of the events, they could write them as there could be an adaptation of the movie as an adventure, in which case the events in the adventure would become canon. Again, assuming they don't have the conflict. And then how it ends, unless a future adventure calls back to that adventure, or another novel shows up, or the next edition has a campaign guide and mentions how it ended, the end of each of the adventures is kind of up in the air. I mean, unless one of the options is the world ends, in which case obviously that one doesn't happen because the world is still spinning. So you run into things like that. You kind of run into that with some of the Star Wars video games too, because they're sequels and they're all they're role-playing games. So you charted the story, and so the sequel. This happened with Knights of the Old Republic. The sequel had to know how the first game went for you. So there's one conversation where you answer based on how you played the first game, and then the other conversations in the game are tooled towards those answers, so that your events of the first game are taken into account in the second game as much as possible. I haven't ever played them, but I think Mass Effect does something like that too. Only there, I think it just accesses your saved games. I think. Could be totally off on that, but I could have sworn I read an article about that. So yeah, you've got, whenever you have sequels to video games that had different endings, the sequel has to assume one of them occurred, especially if they're mutually exclusive endings. And, I don't know, people seem to get upset about that. Well, what about my game? Well, your game still happened for you, but everyone else didn't play it that way specifically. You've got to be flexible. So, so that's the thing with the D&D movie. There's nothing saying that you can't put any of that in your home games. There's a lot of stuff in the movie that is canon as existing in the realms. But it's not a two-way street, okay? The movie borrowed things from canon and then also went its own way with some things. That does not mean that now works in reverse automatically. Now, you as the Dungeon Master, you can allow that, okay? What is it? It's Doric, I think, the druid. She wild shapes way too many times at her level, and I think too frequently, but I know definitely too many times at one point in the movie, and of course the owlbear thing. So her stats for her character specifically allow for that. That doesn't mean that all druids can do that now, automatically. Again, you as the DM can decide that yes, in fact, that does mean that. But that's not to assume that that's the case automatically. That might be the case in the next edition. We don't know yet. And Wizards of the Coast is still clinging to that foolish idea that, there's no more new editions. Yeah, there are. Even if they don't call the current edition 5th edition. Okay? Everyone else does, but they don't. So the fact they don't call the next one 6th edition or 5.5 or 5th edition or advanced 5th edition, or whatever, doesn't mean that that's not what it is, because that will be what it is. So, because unlike what I've seen at least one person say, Wizards of the Coast does not have all the power. Okay, the customers have all the power. Without the customers, there is no Wizards of the Coast. There is no billion-dollar IP. There's no nothing. Okay? They need the customers more than the customers need them. So if the customers decide this thing is this thing, then that's what it is. The company be damned. That's just the way the world works. Again, 5th edition. So, anyway, that was just some thoughts I had after watching some videos by an unnamed lunatic who seems to think that canon is a two-way street with the movie, and it literally can't be, because there are canon conflicts. There has to be a hierarchy. And the movie, which is not performing well at the box office, is not going to be the top of that hierarchy. Or at least it wouldn't in a sane world. I mean, Wizards of the Coast makes insane decisions all the time, so maybe they will say that's the top of the hierarchy. And then they can violate their agreement with Ed Greenwood. Maybe he'll say, well, I'll see you in court. But probably not. He's probably too nice of a guy for that. Anyway, so that was just some thoughts. What do you folks think? How important is canon to you and your games, to movies, to anything? I mean, are you one of those types of people that you watched the first 2 Alien movies, thought they were great, saw the opening to Alien 3, and you're kind of like, hey, wait, none of this happened at the end of Aliens. How is this happening? This is clearly just like cooked this up out of nowhere. There was no time this could have happened. Like the jump from Aliens to Alien 3, they had to get really creative. So are you one of the types of people that looks at that? It's like, no, this is all baloney. I can't deal with this. Or you're like, whatever. Let's see the xenomorph tear some people apart. Or somewhere in between. It bothers you, but you still like Alien 3. Or it bothers you, but you still watched Alien 3 but didn't like it. I don't know. Maybe you've never seen any of the Alien movies and you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. But anyway, let me know your thoughts on the matter. Always enjoy likes and subscribes. This being YouTube, it's the bread and butter here. So anyway, folks, hopefully you listened this far. Appreciate it if you did. But we'll see you later.